I have finally overcome myself to tackle this project, the international airport. I could have made it easy for myself and simply placed this here. But in all honesty, this deformation of a building just looks completely scheisse. I would go so far that this is the ugliest asset I've ever seen. Good job! So I put something new together from the smaller airports and this is the result. My virtual dream city has surpassed 100k citizens, almost at least. So it's time for the international airport, baby. And today you can see part 1 of this massive airport construction project, where the first thing we do is place the terminals, which will expand and make even more beautiful in the next episode. Then we'll also decorate the tarmac, taxiways and runways and detail everything so that it just looks super realistic in the end. So let's start and we'll see how everything turned out in the end. First of all, we had to find a suitable location for the airport. The entire map is relatively hilly and has no big patch of flat land at all. The runways couldn't point directly into the direction of the city center either, because that would simply be relatively atypical and the skyscrapers would also be in the way for the landing approach areas. So I decided to move to this part of the map. It's still quite close to the actual city and who would have guessed it, quite hilly as basically everywhere. But at this spot we also have the option to expand the land further into the ocean and get a large and flat area that has enough room for a massive international airport. It's always hard to find the right scale for airports and city skylines though, so we leveled out the terrain and obviously some mountains had to give way. Then we also extended the land quite a bit into the sea, so the airport is partially located on actual land but also on reclaimed land from the ocean. I also thought that the length of the runways is a bit short in relation to the width and the terminal buildings. That's why I'm going to extend them quite a bit in the second chapter. So we also had to adapt the terrain accordingly. I chose 2 normal airports for the layout and placed them at a 90-degree angle to each other. This way we can enlarge the terminal buildings with additional assets and also have the runway cross, which always looks cool and is practical for the changing wind directions at the coastline. Let me know what you think of that design. The coolest thing about the airport is that it's completely functional and the airplanes also land halfway realistically, since in real life they often only use half of the runway too, so I started by extending the runways. For this I used the small footpaths for the outside boundary, as you can work with the road construction tools here and that definitely makes things easier than if you were just using the surfaces. I then used them to delimit the runway size and then we had to find a solution to fill in the runways with one type of surface. We also had to cover all the markings from the original airport runways, as the markings would obviously no longer be correct if we made the runways about twice as long. So I experimented around a bit about how we could have done it. At first I wanted to use the pillars, but that solution wasn't it this time. But then I had the idea of just using a really wide road using the road builder mod. So I took a simple road and then placed about 20 shoulders on each side. We ended up with a really wide dark grey road that covered the full width, and when you raise it with move it also the markings. This was perfect, so I took one piece and put the nodes on both ends, so the runway is just a single segment. In the end, I even realized that you don't need any lanes in the middle at all and could have just used the hard shoulders and the 2 stripes in the middle would disappear. But I realized and changed that after the build off camera. Then it was time to redraw the markings, which was definitely an extremely time-consuming and painful work. This crosswalk pattern at the very beginning of the runway was kind of the easiest part, but then we had to design the center line first, where I could simply use road markings. That was time consuming and boring, but nothing could theoretically go wrong. Then I had to draw the landing markings by hand. I'm no aviation guy at all, so I based it halfway on the old airport, but I didn't make it too detailed either, because that would really go beyond the scope at some point. Maybe someone of you could tell me somewhat realistic numbers I could paint at the end of the runways. They are still missing. The landing markings probably don't all have the same size and length, but from a distance it actually looks relatively good. Of course, this process had to be repeated 4 times, but I've saved you the trouble of watching that. I think you can imagine how monotonous and repetitive this process was. At this point, I was still thinking to myself, oh dear, this will never end up look like a realistic airport and as detailed as the rest of the city is. But I just kept going, and this project was actually the definition of trust the process. I don't know if the designers of the airport asset have ever seen a real airport in their life, but there we usually have the taxiway layout with these angled access ramps at a 30 or 45 degree angle, which of course don't exist in the original asset at all. So I had to add some of them myself later to get this somewhat realistic look. I used the wide footpaths for this. But I'm no longer sure whether this is also a road builder asset or whether it exists in the vanilla game. In any case, they serve perfectly as taxiway boundaries, and I'm still not sure whether I should leave them light gray at the end, as in the original color of the footpaths, or whether I should paint a second layer over them with the colored surfaces so that they have this light green color, like we have at Californian airports, for example, which of course also looks quite cool. Let me know what you would do. I think the most important part of getting a reasonably realistic airport was building the second side of the taxiways. I don't know if they would realistically make any sense at all at a real airport, but that's where we could really build these ramps that run at a sharp angle, and they just add that extra bit of realism that the original asset just completely lacks, in my opinion. Imagine I would have just used the ugly original international airport instead. No, I would never have done that. It really is a horrible asset. I don't quite understand why some buildings look so nice, like the big coal power plant for example, and some are as unrealistic and ugly as this airport. Well, but this way we can design an airport ourselves, and that's also something. Once we finished building the runways, we can also build a few roads for airport service vehicles to drive along. For this, I used the 2-lane highway, because it looks the most like an airport service road and doesn't have these 2 yellow markings in the middle. These aren't functional in the end and aren't used anyway. That's why it doesn't really matter whether they only go in one direction or not. Now it's time for one of the most important parts to make the airport as realistic as possible. And that is, we use different surfaces with different colors of asphalt and concrete for the tarmac. Airports were mostly built and expanded over time, where different materials were used. But also over the years, asphalt and concrete surfaces need to be repaired and repaved. So we use these surfaces from PDX mods, which have different shades of concrete and asphalt and include different colors from almost pitch black to light gray. We then use a mix of different concrete surfaces for the entire tarmac and taxiways, and even colored both runways in different shades of gray. Like that, it ends up looking like a patchwork quilt, so to speak. We can make the whole thing look nicer later with decals, but we'll then work out all the finer details in the third and final chapter. After that, we'll build a simple alleyway around the airport as a boundary, so to speak. This will also represent the coastline for the most parts, where we will later build a fence around it, but also break water rocks to make everything a little more varied. Here we place smaller footpaths that can be used as small service paths. And then, of course, we can draw the markings on the taxiways. This double yellow line was perfect for this use, and we placed it in the middle of every taxiway. That was actually a lot of fun to draw them, because the snapping and curve function worked extremely well for that case. But sometimes it was also very annoying, because there were these extremely large gray boxes over the entire airport, and you couldn't see anything at all. But somehow these only appear when you use these lane markings. Anyway, thank goodness they were not there also with the surfaces, and then the rough design of the airport would actually already be finished. Here it was done relatively quickly in 12 minutes. But believe me, it really was an extremely time-consuming process, and I almost fell asleep at times because it was all so monotonous. But if you want it to be beautiful, you have to suffer or something like that. Now it's time to add all the finishing touches that make the airport look even better than when everything is the same monotonous color. We use lots of decals for this, and I really mean a lot. So for example, we can create these patched areas on the aprons, because otherwise it would just be a big gray area, and that's usually never the case when you look at a real airport on Google Earth, unless of course they've been built brand new. But that's rather untypical nowadays, in the Western world at least. But to have a brand new airport wasn't the idea behind the whole build at all. After that, we use these sand surfaces to better connect the edges of the tarmac with the grass. Then later we can also use the riverbed surfaces, so we just get a few more different earth and grass tones. But the biggest difference will, of course, make the decals. Maybe I should try that new mod where you can paintbrush on the ground for more textures. Could be quite useful in that case, I can imagine. I know many of you always complain when I've built airports and placed a few bushes in between the runways and taxiways, that it's unrealistic and that the grass is of course always cut very short so that no birds can nest there. But I just find the bare grass texture too flat and it has too little texture for my liking. So I used these very small bushes and placed them in clusters. Then I also used the Ctrl-C mod to copy them and then planted them all over the airport. This definitely saved a lot of time compared to placing each bush individually. You couldn't really use the brush tool either, because these surfaces don't count as real roads, but are simply painted on the ground and the bushes would have been placed all over them as well. So I solved it this way and in the end it went relatively quickly. Then I ended up placing slightly larger trees around the airport because we can have a forest and real vegetation there again, of course. What do you think of the result? I think these small bushes make a bigger difference than if you hadn't planted them. Now and at the end, to really round everything off, the decals are still missing, which represent the tire abrasion from the planes. At almost every airport you always have this black stripe in the middle of the runway where the planes touch the ground. And adding these made such a big difference that it was definitely one of the most important parts of the whole build. I think these decals are from the legend Sully, but I'm not quite sure anymore. I also added different stain decals to represent the concrete edges in the tarmac. And just to make the concrete texture of the runways and taxiways a bit more detailed. In the end, I would say that was one of the most important steps to make the airport look somewhat realistic, and I think I managed to do that quite well.
Strawberry lips burning on my skin, craving for you. I tell myself that the bubblegum wrapper is the sin.
I've been wondering the whole time what's wrong, somehow no planes land here at all. I can't imagine that. The airport is connected to the city and is also supplied with electricity and water. But then I remembered that you have to create the routes yourself in city Skylines too. After that the airplanes finally came and the airport was also used a bit. I was extremely worried that I had built all this for nothing. But then came the relief after not thinking about that feature anymore. At the very end we place a few more airplane props so that the airport doesn't look so empty. And that actually looks better when there are airplanes standing around at the parking positions. And that was also the last thing I was going to do in the first part of the airport project. In one of the next episodes it will be about the terminal design and the connection to the road network and public transportation. What do you think of the position of the airport in the context of the city and the scaling?
Crocodilo.
I think it looks quite cool, but we probably still need to replace the prefab housing estate with normal residential or commercial development, as the buildings are still a bit too high for the approach area, but that's not a big deal. I thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you liked the video, feel free to leave a like, and if you want to have access to the save game, the graphic settings or the mod list for this series, you are very welcome to visit my Patreon page. You'll find everything there, and the playlist for the series is also linked at the end of the video if you are also interested in how we built all the rest. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to all the people who already decided to support me on Patreon so much. See you next time, bye bye.